Classical violinist Nigel Kennedy feared his career was over when he went partly deaf for 3 months after COVID vaccine. Now, partly, I was surprised that this word was used. I would say he went partially deaf. And there is a slight difference between partly and partially, although they can be used interchangeably in most sentences. And if you're interested in the slight difference, you can check the Britannica dictionary, where the editor explains that partially is used more often than partly to modify, that means describe, to modify an adjective or past participle. And deaf, partly deaf, partially deaf. We'd normally use partially to modify an adjective, so partially deaf is better, or a past participle. So they give you 3 examples. His face was partially concealed by the beard. The snow had partially melted. Our vacation was partially paid for by the company, although I would say that partly is certainly possible in that last one as well. And so they're often interchangeable. But partly is used more often than partially before clauses and phrases offered as explanation. So we trusted him partly because he was elderly. Partly means in part, in part because he was elderly, and I would not use partially in that sentence personally. I would say partly. Partly for this reason, not partially for this reason, partly for this reason, we decided not to buy the house. And I called him again, partly to reassure him. And so partly describes clauses and phrases, verb phrases like 2+ infinitives, and clauses that start with subordinating conjunctions. And this is before a prepositional phrase. But partly describes phrases and clauses, partially describes adjectives or participles. And that's the main difference. But a lot of the time, they are interchangeable. Anyway, let's come back to poor Nigel Kennedy, who is a very famous violinist. He is the best-selling classical violinist of all time and has wowed global audiences performing with the likes of Paul McCartney, The Who and Led Zeppelin. So you can see that this is a very famous guy. And this the likes of is an interesting expression. It just means with people such as, with the likes of, with people such as Paul McCartney, The Who and Led Zeppelin. But Nigel Kennedy has told how he feared, he was afraid, he feared he might never play professionally again when he suffered partial deafness. And look, they've used partial here for the noun, partial deafness. And that's why, another reason I prefer partially deaf. But he suffered partial deafness for 3 months after having his 3rd COVID jab in 2021. I wasn't in a fit state to play concerts, the 67-year-old told The Guardian, adding, I didn't want to play with colleagues while I was playing out of tune. If your instrument is out of tune, then you need to fiddle with the instrument so that it gets in tune. And so a piano player needs to tune the piano before he gives a concert, and a violinist needs to tune his violin. But his hearing was out of tune. He said his hearing loss was more to do with, connected to, more to do with the overtones and the intonation than the volume level. He is reportedly not certain the COVID vaccine was responsible, but he cited another musician who had also lost his hearing. Kennedy, who has 3 homes in North London, Poland and Malvern, Worcestershire, said his hearing loss happened around the same time as his breaking his little finger while trying to restrain his dog. His 1989 recording of Vivaldi's 4 Seasons sold more than 3 million copies, making it the best-selling classical recording ever and catapulting him to the upper echelons of the classical music world. Upper echelons, I think we normally pronounce it, but of the classical music world, the upper levels, the upper levels of the classical music world. Speaking ahead of his upcoming concert at the Barbican, he said he built from the ground upwards to regain his ability to hear the overtones and the undertones of the notes once more. And here he is here, and here he is here again. I was able to work on my intonation and get my hearing back. Maybe if I wasn't a musician, I wouldn't really have got the hearing back, because in music, you're teaching yourself to listen all the time. I think I've now got better intonation than I had before. Well, that is good news. If you're faced by a dilemma like that, you can't really panic about it, because all you can do is the best to overcome the problem. And that's a good expression. You overcome your problems, hopefully. He suggested he had only confessed to experiencing hearing loss now. Yeah, why is it that he's only come out and told everybody about this now? As he didn't want everyone coming to my concert thinking he's playing out of tune. Okay, so he didn't want to do concerts and play out of tune. He added, I don't mind people knowing now because I'm playing right bang in the middle of the notes. It's all right now. I don't think anyone could really fault my intonation. There might be some other musicians who suffered from the same thing. It's beyond just musicians. If you're suddenly feeling like you're catatonic at 4 o'clock every day, I'm sure that's happened to a lot of people. So he's suggesting that lots of people started feeling catatonic at around the same time that he lost his hearing for some reason. Yeah, and so perhaps it's some kind of adverse reaction to something that people might have taken. The musician said he also suffered extreme tiredness, turning into a zombie and nodding off whatever he was doing. I'd wake up and think, thank God I haven't dropped the violin. If I had had it in my hand, that's something which has never happened to me before. Kennedy, whose main home is in the Polish countryside just outside Krakow, where he lives with his artist wife Agnieszka, had previously spoken about his fears over COVID vaccines. In an August interview with the Mail, he suggested he was happy his only son, the only son that he has, Sark, 27, who was twice jailed for supplying cocaine, hadn't had the COVID vaccine. So he's very happy that he hasn't had the COVID vaccine. We were closed down and he got through the whole of COVID without having to have the vaccine. That's good. Which is a good thing, as people are now finding out bad news about vaccines, he said. Okay? He said. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency has been approached for comment on the virtuoso violinist's latest claims. The watchdog previously said deafness and hearing loss are not currently recognised as side effects for any of the COVID-19 vaccines currently deployed in the UK in response to a 2021 Freedom of Information request. It said that as of June the 10th, 2021, there had been 579 reports of hearing loss linked to the AstraZeneca vaccine, 269 reports after the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and 11 reports following the Moderna jab, but said it was important to note that the nature of the yellow card reporting means that reported events are not always proven side effects.